Good evening, everybody, especially those of you who are just joining us after, who weren't here for the talk. Thank you for coming. My name is Judah Adachi. This is the Evolution Contemporary Music Series. This is our 8th season, and it's been really a terrific season. We are in great debt to a lot of the people, literally, actually, to a lot of the people, we're in great debt to a lot of the people who are here. We ran a Kickstarter at the beginning of this season, and we had 144 backers and made something close to 10 grand. And that's how this season has happened. And it's been a real gift. So thank you very much to all of you who supported it, and thank you for supporting it by coming. It's been kind of a long journey. This is really our capstone concert this season. We started, one of our Kickstarter rewards at the beginning of the year was showing Len Kammerling's film of Strange and Sacred Noise, John's percussion quartet. And now we've come full circle back to John's music, and it's kind of the, like I said, the capstone concert. We've been looking forward to it all year. This has been kind of in the making for a long time. John and I have done a lot of email and phone calls, and I have to say it's been a pleasure to do that. Initially, we had big ideas about bringing him here for a week and all this stuff, but it couldn't have worked out better from our standpoint. He's been here a couple of days, and we're thrilled with the music of his that we're going to present to you. We talked a little bit about this. It's not every day that John's solo and chamber music is kind of presented in a portrait evening like this. Often, a lot of you probably know John's music from his big pieces, especially Inuksuit. We will not have 9 to 99 percussionists on stage today. It's much more, we wanted, given our space and given what we do, much like we did with Kaya Sariaho's music, to capture kind of a more intimate side of what John does, and maybe give you some insights into his work and a connection to his work that you couldn't have had in a big experience. I want to mention that we have a bunch of John's CDs available after the show. All these great recordings on Cold Blue, the Cold Blue label. And we also have several books throughout the evening. We're going to run without an intermission tonight. And John is going to be doing kind of these interlude readings from his writings between pieces. So some of those, I assume, are included in the books that are out there. Winter Music, the place where you go to listen, and then this new book, a book of essays about John's music by others. So I hope you'll check those out. And most importantly, I hope you'll join us just for a wine reception to meet John, meet Cindy Adams, and kind of welcome them and thank them for joining us. With that, I'm very happy to introduce my friend Ken Osowski, who's going to open the program.
Number 5, 1950, was Mark Rothko's last painting before the breakthrough into his mature format. In it, the luminous color fields of a classic Rothko are inscribed across the middle with 3 delicate lines. Describing this painting and its pivotal position in Rothko's work, Brian O'Doherty writes, "After this, the lines disappear completely." In 1988, after the premiere of The Far Country of Sleep, my friend Leif Thompson made a prophetic observation. "Especially like that middle section," he said to me. "You know, the part where nothing happens? That's what you really want to do, isn't it?" Leif was right. And a decade later, in The Immeasurable Space of Tones and The Light That Fills the World, I finally took that leap. But if these works constitute a breakthrough in my music, it was a long time coming. From the earliest works in my catalog, I now hear an inexorable evolution to this new sound world. Over the course of 25 years, line and figuration gradually disappear. What began as background has finally advanced into the foreground to become a musical world composed entirely of floating fields of color. Not long ago, I revisited Mondrian. Looking at photographs of his sketches, I was struck by their similarity to Rothko's rectangles. Compositionally, Mondrian's sketches resemble even more Richard Diebenkorn's Ocean Park paintings. Whether filled with color, as in Rothko and Diebenkorn, or described only by black lines on empty white fields, as in Mondrian's sketchbook, the dynamic balances of the forms are strikingly similar. Rothko is widely regarded as a colorist, but he thought of himself as a formalist. It's not only the colors, it's the shapes, the proportions, and the edges of his forms that give his colors their extraordinary power. Even when the subject is color, the forms of the color describe lines. In music, line, form, and color are equally inseparable. The moment one chord changes to another, we hear the beginning of a line. And the moment a single tone moves, we begin to hear harmony. It might seem that the only harmony we wouldn't hear melodically would be a harmony that never changes. But in his Dreamhouse installations, Lamont Young has revealed rich melodic worlds within dense, static, harmonic clouds. We might imagine that the only melody we wouldn't hear harmonically would be a melody on one note. But Jacinto Scelsi discovered expansive harmonic richness within a solitary tone. At first, I imagined my color works as a kind of monophonic or monolithic music, an entire piece as one rich and complex sound. Gradually, I came to hear them as homophonic textures, like extraordinarily slow chorales, unfolding over the course of an entire piece. Now, after composing several works in this world that I had thought was completely free of lines, I've come to hear it as a sort of polyphony of harmonic clouds. So maybe the lines never disappear completely. Maybe Christian Wolff was right when he quipped, "No matter what we do, sooner or later, it all sounds melodic." I've always been intimidated by the piano. As a performer, I never played it very well. As a composer, I've never felt as though I could make the instrument my own. Several years ago, on a trip to New York City, I heard the premiere performance of a lovely chamber work by Kyle Gann that embraces multiple tempos without sustaining them all at the same time. On the way home to Alaska, I passed through Seattle. In the Seattle airport, there's a large painting by Frank Stella. It's one of his protractor works in which arcs of bright colors weave in and out of one another in a dizzying counterpoint of imaginary planes. Studying this painting after hearing Gann's music, it occurred to me that I might be able to do something similar with the piano. Virtually all of my music is composed in 4, 5, or 6 simultaneous tempo layers. If my ensemble and orchestral pieces are multidimensional sculptures, then Among Red Mountains is more like a drawing. In this piece, the challenge that I set for myself was to suggest 5 independent tempo planes within the limitations of 2 hands and what the pianist Vicky Ray calls the big black box. The title, Among Red Mountains, is the translation of a Gwich'in Athabascan place name for a place in the Brooks Range north of Arctic Village. Gordon Wright was the friend of a lifetime. For 30 years, Gordon and I shared our two greatest passions, music and Alaska. Gordon was my musical collaborator, my next-door neighbor, my fellow environmentalist, my camping buddy. Like Alaska, Gordon was larger than life. He lived his way, and he died just as he would have wanted. We found him lying on the deck of his cabin in the Chugach Mountains, curled up against his favorite birch tree, looking across the waters of Turnagain Arm toward Resurrection Valley and the tiny settlement of Hope, Alaska. Three High Places contains no normal stopped tones. All the sounds are produced as natural harmonics or on open strings. The violinist's fingers and the strings of the violin never touch the fingerboard. And I think if I could have made this music without the fingers ever touching the strings, I would have. Credo, in memory of Gordon Wright. I believe in the mystery of being, in the wholeness of life, and the spirit in all things. I believe in the tundra, in the forests, in the rivers, and the nameless mountains stretching to the sea. I believe in the music of the rising wind, the rushing water, and the bell tones of the hermit thrush ringing in the twilight. I believe we are relatives of the moose and the swans, of the birch, the cranberry, and the wild rose. I believe that our destiny is to know our place, to live in peace, and to listen to the earth. won't subject you to the entire essay, but I would like to read the last part of a 2003 essay titled Global Warming and Art. What does global climate change mean for art? What's the value of art in a world on the verge of melting? An Orkney Island fiddler once observed, "Art must be of use." By counterpoint, John Cage said, "Only what one person alone understands helps all of us." Can they both be right? Is art an esoteric luxury? Do the dreams and visions of art still matter? An artist lives between two worlds, the world we inhabit and the world we imagine. Like surgeons are social workers, carpenters are truck drivers, artists are both workers and citizens. As citizens, we can vote. We can write letters to our elected officials and to the editors of our newspapers. We can speak out. We can run for office. We can march in demonstrations. We can pray. Ultimately, though, the best thing that artists can do is to create art. To compose, to paint, to write, to dance, to sing. Art is our first obligation to ourselves and our children, to our communities and our world. Art is our work. An essential part of that work is to see new visions and give voice to truths, both new and old. Art is not self-indulgence. It is not an aesthetic or an intellectual pursuit. Art is a spiritual aspiration and a discipline. It is an act of faith. In the midst of the darkness that seems to be descending all around us, art is a vital testament to the best qualities of the human spirit. As it has throughout history, art expresses our belief that there will be a future for humanity. It gives voice and substance to hope. Our courage for the present and our hope for the future lie in that place in the human spirit that finds solace and renewal in art. Art embraces beauty, but beauty is not the object of art. It's merely a byproduct. The object of art is truth. That which is true is that which is whole. In a time when human consciousness has become dangerously fragmented, art helps us recover wholeness. In a world devoted to material wealth, art connects us to the qualitative and the non-material. In a world addicted to consumption and power, art celebrates emptiness and surrender. In a world accelerating to greater and greater speed, art reminds us of the timeless. In the presence of war, terrorism, and looming environmental disaster, artists can no longer afford the facile ironies of postmodernism. We may choose to speak directly to world events, or we may work at some distance removed from them. But whatever our subject, whatever our medium, artists must commit ourselves to the discipline of art with the depth of our being. To be worthy of a life's devotion, art must be our best gift to a troubled world. Art must matter. We human animals have become an unprecedented force of nature. We're literally changing the climate of the earth, threatening the entire biosphere, that miraculous network of connections that sustains all life on this planet, including ourselves. Ecosystems all over the world are in imminent danger of losing their wholeness and diversity, their capacity to sustain themselves. With ever-expanding global commerce, the same is true for diverse human cultures. If we hope to survive, we have no choice but to expand our awareness, to recognize our interdependence and our obligations to all human cultures and to all forms of life with which we share this beautiful stone spinning in space. Global warming is a disturbing manifestation of the inescapable truth that anything we do anywhere affects everything everywhere. If we choose to ignore this in our day-to-day lives, we may pay a terrible price on a planetary scale. The same is true for art and culture. Just as global climate change threatens the health of the biosphere, commercial monoculture threatens the integrity of the cultural sphere, from Greenland to Australia, from Papua New Guinea to Siberia. Through the science of ecology, we've become increasingly aware of the rich diversity of species and ecosystems on the Earth. At the same time, with the advent of electronic media and instant communications, we've become increasingly aware of the rich diversity of human cultures on the Earth. We now understand that we need as many distinct plant and animal species as possible, living in whole, sustainable ecosystems. We also need the distinctive voices and visions of as many human cultures as possible. Artists use the tools of perception and imagination to evoke the sound, the light, the feeling of our times and places. Art embraces creative thought. Creative thought is a fundamental part of our participation in creation. It's also essential to solving the problems of the world, from war and hunger to extinction and, yes, global warming. Amid the daunting realities of our time, the work of artists may prove to be more important than ever. In the popular mythology, Alaska is the last frontier. But global warming signals the end of the frontier. Now, even at the ends of the earth, even in the most remote wilderness, no place on this planet remains untouched by the actions of human beings. 4 decades ago now, I came to Alaska to get away from the world. But the world has followed me here in an inescapable way. I also came to help save the wilderness. For years, I worked as an environmental activist. When I left that work, I did so with the feeling that someone else could carry on my part in it, but that no one else could make my music. Implicit in this choice was my belief that in a different way, music could matter as much as activism. In recent years, as the signs of climate change have become undeniable, I felt with increased urgency my responsibility to live up to this belief. Today, as the horrors of war fill the news, I'm wondering about the meaning of my life's work. In my current work, I'm searching for musical equivalents of pure color, combining instrumental music with auras of computer-processed sounds. But how can I spend my time on such esoteric things? How can I make art that doesn't speak directly to world events? Then I remember Claude Monet. In 1914, the fabric of Western civilization seemed to be disintegrating. The First World War was raging. Monet was in his garden painting water lilies. His own son was in the war. The front advanced to within 35 miles of his home. Yet Monet continued to shuffle out to the garden and paint the reflections of the clouds and willows in the waters of the pond at Giverny. To a friend, Monet confided that he felt ashamed of thinking about little researches into color and form while so many suffer and die. Though he was old and in failing health, he might have found more immediate ways to express his concern about the state of the world. Instead, while young men died in combat within the borders of his own country, Monet painted water lilies. And the world is richer for his doing so. Those expansive panels of water, flowers, and mirrored sky were probably his greatest and most enduring gift to humanity. Politics is fast. By definition, it's public. Art is slow, and it often begins in solitude. In order to give our best gifts to the troubled world in which we live, artists must sometimes leave the world behind, at least for a little while. It's a brilliant April morning. Sunlight shimmers on the snow. Last night in the calm valleys, the temperature touched on 20 below. With a renewed sense of hope and purpose, I returned to work in my studio.